So I wasn't entirely sure how to introduce Dr. West, and earlier today I asked the International Students Officer, Fannie, and he gave me a wonderful bit of advice. He said to me, the 2 minutes you spend introducing Dr. West would probably be better spent allowing Dr. West to speak for 2 minutes extra. And I'll take up half of his advice by very quickly introducing Dr. West. And actually also just reminding us of the reason why actually Dr. West is here. Dr. West is here to unveil this artwork that will be put up in Coffee Revolution to commemorate the visit of Malcolm X on December the 4th, 1964, 3 months before his assassination. He came and spoke at the Students' Union. It was the largest event to that date the Students' Union had ever held. 700 people packed out the interval. And what is currently the interval? At the time it was the auditorium. Since then we've had this wonderful building constructed that you have the great pleasure of sitting in right now. But I suppose the fullness of that room reminds me of something someone told me. They said to me, and I don't know how true this is, so I hope it's true, but they said to me, when the LSE was occupied in 1968 by students, radical students, desperate for a better world, and of the 6,000 students at the LSE at the time, 4,000 occupied. 4,000 took direct political action because they genuinely believed that they could in some way contribute to a better reality being created. And I suppose the slight tragedy is that today, could we really be confident that those sorts of numbers of people would have the political confidence in themselves to think that their activity and actions as students could genuinely make the world a slightly even better place? And I hope, I really do, I really hope that this artwork will stay in Coffee Revolution for a long time. In the words of Solomon, our Union Development Officer, will put the revolution back into Coffee Revolution. But I also hope that maybe a stray first year will perhaps look at the picture and say to themselves, I wonder who that character is. May go on Wikipedia or Google or something, find out who they are, be inspired, and desperately believe to themselves that that actually there is some space for dissent, as a student, political dissent. That actually the subversion of constituted bodies of power is a significant part of what it means to be a student. That actually reimagining the world is a desperately important part of what it means to be a student. The dissatisfaction is to be glorified in the status quo that isn't to the best interests of the majority of people, that inequality is not to be ignored, and that actually to acquiesce the inequalities of the world as currently constituted is a bloody awful thing. So I'll leave it to Dr. West to speak on whatever matter he hopes, because he's an extraordinary speaker, and I actually watched him convince a room of future investment bankers at the Oxford Union to vote for occupying Wall Street. So that's not a sign of how brilliant the person is within all of this.
Woo!
What a blessing to be here at Sheffield, at the University of Sheffield. I want to thank Brother Abdi with all of his courage, his eloquence, and his vision of inviting a simple man, Brother West, to come salute a giant, spiritual giant, a political giant, born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, but known to the world in the most barbaric of all centuries, the 20th century. These 100 million fellow human beings, each one precious, killed in the name of some vicious and pernicious ideology, a gangster of a nation state. The voice of Malcolm X still rings loud, and this is one of the few institutions in the world that has the wisdom to say we're going to put our brother, our black brother, our freedom-loving brother on the wall of Cafe Revolution. I salute the University of Sheffield. I salute the University of Sheffield. Each and every one of them. Salute Brother Keith, who is the captain of the ship, and Sister Ruth, who plays such a crucial role. I want to thank our dear Sister Sarah for those wonderful words. And Brother Abdullah, you are eloquent too. I could listen to both of these brothers all night. All night indeed. Brother Joshua, who's just got his PhD, the new doctor in the house. New doctor in the house. And each and every one of you, and you can see I'm in no rush. Every day I'm blessed to come to Sheffield and salute my dear brother Malcolm X. But when Brother Abdi mentioned to me the possibility of coming here and trying to just continue to build in my own feeble and finite way on the rich legacy of not just Malcolm X, but of course it's a cacophony of voices. There's no Malcolm without Elijah Muhammad. There's no Malcolm without Martin Luther King Jr. There's no Malcolm without Fannie Lou Hamer. There's no Malcolm without A. Philip Randolph and Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells. And then you got some freedom-loving brothers and sisters on the vanilla side of town. Oh, there's John Brown, there's Miles Horton, Asian sister like Grace Boggs, Palestinian brother like Edward Said. We can go on and on and on. This is a human affair. But oftentimes, for so long, when people talked about the human, it didn't include folk like Malcolm X. It didn't include black people. It didn't include red people, precious indigenous brothers and sisters. It didn't include women across the board. It often overlooked our gay brothers and lesbian sisters and bisexuals and transgender. Oftentimes it downplayed our precious Arab brothers and sisters. No, this is a human affair across the board. And when you all look at the eyes of Malcolm X, you want to see the best of what it means to be human. So I want to begin on a Socratic note, that Malcolm was very much a Socratic figure. That's what got him in trouble. As I recall, of course, he had to zip in and out of London because he was an extremist. And the UK didn't really want him in the country, but Oxford has a way of justifying a whole host of persons gaining access to England. They said he's part of the Oxford Union debate. Oh, I guess we can let him in. A little consultation with the CIA and say, what do you think? Well, we're against it, but Oxford is Oxford is Oxford. Let him in. But I'm going to turn to line 38A of Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Malcolm X says what? The examined life is painful. It takes courage. It's not just a matter of being smart. It's certainly not just a matter of making money. It has to do with what kind of person you will choose to be. We know the Greek actually said the unexamined life is not a life of the human. And our English word human derived from the Latin humando, which means burying. That we are beings toward not just death, the way Heidegger talked about it, but corpses, the way Vico talks about it. We're not here that long. And Malcolm X forces us to wrestle with the most terrifying question we will ever have to come to terms with. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? That's who we are. Put on my three-piece suit if I want to and act like I'm so big and bad, but if it wasn't for my mama's love push, I wouldn't be here. And my hunch is that's true for you too, and it's certainly true for mine. So with humans, cuts across color, class, sexual orientation, civilization, culture, national identity. It has to do with what kind of choices we make in terms of the kind of human beings we will be in a short time in our move from mama's womb to tomb. Because one day, very soon, our bodies will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. What will they say about us when they put us in the ground, in the grave? Malcolm was put there February 1965. We've been talking about him ever since. Why? Because he took so seriously what ought to sit at the very center of any university, which is deep education, not cheap schooling. And I know that's what goes on at the University of Sheffield at its best. Every institution has a best and a worst. But at its best, what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, that deep education, wrestling with the formation of attention. How do we learn to attend to the things that matter in a culture that specializes in weapons of mass distraction? Trying to convince us to be obsessed with money, 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 power, power, power. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, show me a culture obsessed with just money and power, and I'll show you a people whose conception of life was a gold rush, and therefore they will end up worshiping golden calves. And this is certainly true in my country. And my hunch is I could find a little bit of this operating in Britain too. The rule of big money, big corporate power, where the conception of being human is more and more to be titillated and stimulated or even addicted to superficial things, the things on the surface. No, paideia is about the formation of attention, of joy and sorrow, agony and anguish, life and death, non-market values like love. Justice is what love looks like in public. Just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. Malcolm X's reputation in public was one of a brother full of righteous indignation and holy anger, moral outrage. But believe me, he was also a militant for gentleness. He was a subversive for sweetness, and a radical for tenderness. Anybody who met Malcolm, the first thing they would say about him is, what a tender man. And he doesn't appear that way on television. Well, no, because when you actually have a deep love of people, you have an intense hatred when those people are treated unjustly and unfairly. And there's a fire inside of you, and if you don't do something, the rocks are gonna cry out. That's what Malcolm had. Reminds me of line 24a in Plato's Apology, where Socrates says, the cause of my unpopularity was parrhesia, P-A-R-R-H-E-S-I-A, which is fearless speech. Socrates had a way of going about enacting plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech, and that will get you in trouble. It's a beautiful thing. The University of Sheffield allowed Malcolm to engage in parrhesia. Oh yes, he had the courage to say, I'm going to critically examine myself, society, and the world, and I'm going to communicate directly, concisely, lucidly, not mediated with a whole lot of academic jargon that generates an attention to the speaker rather than the subject matter. This country produced one of the great philosophers of the 20th century named R.G. Collingwood. I love that brother. And he said philosophy is fundamentally about keeping track of the subject matter, not the subject who's articulating what the subject matter is. And what do we love about Malcolm? When you left Malcolm, or you left one of his speeches, they didn't say what they said about Cicero. Cicero gave a speech and said, wasn't that a great speech? What are you talking about? I don't know, but it was a great speech. No, it was Demosthenes. When you left a speech by Demosthenes, what did you do? You're ready to march. There's a fundamental difference between Cicero-like speech. It's very sophisticated and subtle, very pretty, but did it connect heart and soul and mind so that the body's willing to be on the edge of the abyss and make a leap of faith and action and thought? Demosthenes, born with a stutter, knew how to straighten up and speak directly. Malcolm X understood that history of Western rhetoric at its best. And where did he read it? In a cell. He turned his cell into a classroom. He turned his dictionary into an encyclopedia. So he went in as a gangster. Malcolm Little, patriarchy, misogynist, sexist, and racist against white brothers and sisters. Well, people think that black people be racist, we have no institutional power. Well, we can still be full with a lot of prejudice. It's still wrong. It's still immoral. It's still something that ought to make anybody with a moral sensibility ashamed. But Malcolm needed to grow. This is precisely what education at its deepest level is about anywhere in the world. Learning how to die in order to learn how to live. When Montaigne, the finest of all of the early European philosophers who invented the essay as a genre, he said, to philosophize is to learn how to die. And Seneca, we don't expect too much profundity from the Romans. The Greeks, we understand. The Romans, well, I don't know. They were running an empire. Didn't have a lot of time. Reminds me of an empire in place today. My own. Where we love intelligence but hate intellect. Intelligence, manipulative faculty to make money and position. Intellect to engage in inquiry about the deepest questions. But Seneca was right when he said he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. And you looking at a brother here, our brother, who learned how to die. Because anytime you question your own assumptions and presuppositions, anytime you give up any one of them, anytime you question your prejudgments and prejudices and give up any one of them, that's a form of death. And the only way you grow, the only way you mature, the only way you develop is to critically examine certain dogma, doctrine, and you end up having to give some of it up. You can never give it all up at the same time because you still got to live. But you give up enough so that you learn how to die. There is no rebirth without death. Malcolm X was reborn over and over and over again because he had courage, and it wasn't just curiosity. There's a fundamental difference between curiosity and perplexity. Curiosity has to do oftentimes with what we associate with scientists in the laboratory. It's a beautiful thing. It's a magnificent thing. Science as an institution and all of its complex developments is something that we ought to promote, but it ought to be under the aegis of some kind of moral imperatives. That's what you're going to use it for. And perplexity usually is tied to existential issues. It's like the five howls at the end of Shakespeare's King Lear. Those howls are not howls of curiosity. They're howls of existential perplexity. It's an existential shiver and shudders like Gerda in the realm of the mothers in Faust the classic. Fundamental existential vertigo, let's put it that way. That's called education. Now, I know many of you had experience when you leave the classroom and you want to take the text and throw it against the wall. Toni Morrison's Beloved was too much for you, too many corpses at the end of Hamlet. Or Thomas Harding, the heavy darkness of the evolutionary sensibility, but that rich love of Brother Thomas Harding shot through every text. And you say, my God, why am I even existing and surviving and trying to thrive? And you say, yes, now that's education. That's paideia. That's what Malcolm X experienced in the cell in Massachusetts. What am I doing? What is my genuine calling? Not just my career. What's my genuine vocation? Not just my profession. What is my genuine life task? Not just my job or whatever job I'll have access to when I leave the cell. Of course, the same questions and queries. All the brothers and sisters of all colors here at University of Sheffield. And I'm not associating university with a cell. It's just a different moment in your life. Qualitatively different moments. Malcolm's cell is a university. Your university is a university. I guess maybe you've got some bondage stories you can share with me, but we won't go into that at the moment. Learning how to die, mustering the courage to critically examine who we are. And we begin with ourselves. It's not a matter of beginning with name calling and finger pointing. It's a matter of trying to muster the courage to try to understand what has been deposited inside of us. But Malcolm X, who had such a hatred of white supremacy, the first place he had to look was inside his own soul. The white supremacy inside of him. And it's no accident that the first 7 years of his life he would be primarily talking about the white supremacy inside of black people. He didn't need white brothers and sisters around to see white supremacy operating among black folk. They had taught and accepted the view that they were less beautiful, less moral, less intelligent. They had consented to their own domination. They had consented to their own subordination. They needed an awakening. They needed to be reborn. Same is true with our sisters. Too many women we know still got male supremacy inside of them, thinking they somehow are less intelligent than some bloke sitting next to them. And I like saying bloke because we don't say that in America. I know it's a British thing. Oh, I know it's a British thing. But I am a bloke here and I'm a bloke there. But that's where the courage comes in. That's what William Butler Yeats, probably the finest poet in the English language of the barbaric 20th century, meant when he said it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of your soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Who really has the courage to examine themselves, or who just wants to flow through from womb to tomb and somehow gain access to fleeting money, power, and status and become well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference. William James used to say indifference is the one trait that makes the very angels weep. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself. And we're living at a time, the expansion of callousness toward catastrophe, indifference to forms of criminality. And it's not just a major move to the ideological right, even though that's a part of it, but it's also moral and spiritual, or what we are used to accepting and taking for granted. I mean, we in the United States, for example, 1976, Gerald Ford stepped up in front of the American people and said, as a result of the Church Commission, we will never as a country engage in assassinating any peoples in other places, let alone our own citizens. Fast forward to 2013 and Gerald Ford becomes a major figure on the cutting edge of social justice. Now, that is not encouraging. Because the forms of criminality at work coming out of the American empire, drones dropping bombs on innocent people in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, 219 innocent children killed so far, no acknowledgement even of the drone activity. And now head of the CIA saying, we have not killed one civilian 2 years ago. And you say, quit lying. We were born at night, but not last night. Don't insult our intelligence. Don't you know that those precious children in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan have exactly the same status as precious children born in New York, Las Vegas, Ethiopia, Sheffield, Argentina, New Mexico, Canada, any other place? But oh, it's so easy to come in different until it comes to our house. When it hits our neighborhood, then all of a sudden it becomes a matter of crisis. I had a wonderful dialogue just 2 days ago with my dear brother Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. We had a dialogue for an hour and a half. It'll be on the radio show this week. The Smiley and West show. That's not an advertisement. That's just a matter of letting you know what's going on. I'm saying you got to check it out at all. Let you know what's right. Because the dialogue had a deep effect on me. I looked in that brother's eyes and I said, how do you sustain your hope? You're in trouble. You're in deep trouble. And he said, I'm deeply influenced by Martin Luther King and others. And he could have added Malcolm X. Because when Malcolm X came to the University of Sheffield, he was in deep trouble. He knew that the CIA were keeping track of every step and every word. But did he back down? Did he cave in? Or was he true to himself? I could almost hear Brother Malcolm wrestling with the words of the great W.E.B. Du Bois. When he was 89 years old, he embarked on a trilogy of novels, 3 novels. The Ordeal of Mansart, and Mansart found the school, and City of Colors. 89 years old. On page 275 of that first novel, Du Bois said, I've been wrestling with questions all of my life. I have yet to provide an adequate answer. And the questions are these. How shall integrity face oppression? How shall honesty face deception? How shall decency face insult? And how does virtue meet brute force? Just those questions. Questions of integrity, or what the great Jane Austen calls constancy. What it means to be a person with a moral center and an ethical consistency over time and space. Issues of honesty, just being honest and trying to tell the truth can lead you to be a revolutionary. Transgressing powers that be, not because you're waving a flag and want attention, you just want to be decent in the short time that you're here from mama's womb to tomb. Issues of just decency and honesty and virtue. And not virtues in the abstract sense. Because we all fail. I mean, Samuel Beckett is right. You try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. Thank you, Brother Beckett. You understand the condition of each and every one of us. But at least we know what we aspire to. But these days, it's so easy just to turn our backs on what's going on. Poor people, poor children, to turn our backs, as I know you all are not, when it comes to privatizing public education and trying to reduce something so precious as critical examination and Socratic energy to some utilitarian product to be manipulated in the market with oligarchs and plutocrats in the driver's seat with big banks and big money disproportionately shaping not just policy but the very way in which we conceive of ourselves. And these are spiritual forms of bondage, psychic forms of bondage, as well as socioeconomic and political. That's what our brother understood. That's why I love that brother so. And I'm a Christian and he's a Muslim. That's fine. We've got some theological disagreements. That's fine. Oh, we come together. We come together strong. We come together strong. I'm a Jesus-loving free black man. He was a Muhammad-loving free black man, and we both come together. Why? Because we're just trying to be decent and honest and trying to enact some kind of integrity, even though we fall on our faces and still attempt to bounce back, but know that powers that be view that as in some way a threat when it becomes live and vital and vibrant in the lives of those sly stones, fly in the family stone, called everyday people. Of those in my tradition, James Cleveland, the gospel tradition, calls ordinary people. And ordinary people, or simple people, the way my brother introduced it, I love that phrase, do extraordinary things. And simplicity is always tied at its best to profundity. And the simplistic is not the same as the simple. When you're simple, you've already wrestled with the things we ought to attend to, the life and death and joy and sorrow that I talked about at the very beginning. Now Malcolm X, in so many ways, in his juxtaposition of Socrates, presents a challenge to the grand sage of Athens. Because Socrates, of course, is known never to have shed tears, never to have cried. And Malcolm X would ask, anybody who's never shed a tear or cried and never loved a concrete human being. You can love wisdom, you can even love principles, you can even love integrity in the abstract, but when your mama's in the grave or when your friend betrays you, some tears are going to flow. Socrates was obsessed with self-mastery and self-control. This brother here comes out of a tradition and a peoples who begin with tears, just like our Jewish brothers and sisters in the Hebrew scripture. Begins with cries and tears of affliction, hurt, wound, scars, looking for a way of wrestling with the numbness, to be injected with a fire. Do justice, be righteous. And of course, Christians and Muslims flow out of that legacy of Jerusalem. Now, we've had some spiritual Oedipus complex problems in terms of the relation of Christianity and Islam to Judaism. But it goes back to the fundamental conception of being human. To be human is to spread hesed, loving kindness to the stranger, the orphan, the widow, the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the worker, anybody who is rebuked, scorned, demeaned, and degraded. And that is the measure of greatness. And that still, for me, sets the standard. That's why I'm not impressed with high levels of success. I don't want to know how successful people are. I want to know what they're using their success for. I want to know how faithful they are to standards of greatness. And he who she is greatest among you will be your servant, will have a quality of service to the least of these. The 25th chapter of Matthew, for those of us who take that New Testament seriously. And our secular agnostic brothers and sisters, our secular atheist brothers and sisters can still build in so many creative ways on what it means to be human when you put compassion and empathy at the center, which means, Malcolm would say, we've got to out-Socratize Socrates. We need a Socrates who cries, a Socrates who laughs. I like a Socrates who break dances, but that might be asking for too much. Just shed some tears. Let us know that your heart is not chilly, that your conscience is not coarsened. You see, let us know that empathy and connection with neighbor is crucial. And myself as a Christian, even love of enemy. Because Malcolm X knew that if you take a stand and speak clearly, you're going to have a lot of enemies. And if you don't have enemies, there's a good chance you don't stand for anything. Brother Martin used to say, anybody who doesn't stand for anything, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And what are people falling for today? Market values. Money, money, money. Me. I. Raw ambition, careerism, severed from compassion, severed from sensitivity to the suffering of others. I do think, my dear brother Abdi, that there's a kind of renaissance taking place among the younger generation. I've been blessed to travel all around the globe now, and I can feel it in the air. I think it has something to do with leaders like yourself. And by leaders, it's not just student body president, because that's a magnificent achievement to be student body president, but also leaders of various organizations that say, we're not obsessed with putting others down. We're not obsessed with being examples of pure morality. We just want to be decent. We just want to enact some integrity. And we want to do all the homework we can. We want to learn from a variety of intellectual traditions. Malcolm was like this. Hey, Malcolm, we know that you talk about capitalism. You talk about capitalism, vampire capitalism. You talk about the ways in which imperial tentacles are seizing resources in Africa. You must be a Marxist. No, I'm just in conversation with some folk. It's a rich tradition, it's a form of intellectual weaponry, but it's also tied to my sense of integrity. I can't be a decent person if I don't understand the role of capital and the asymmetric relation of bosses and workers, and why organized workers are being pushed against the wall, and why, so in America, 42% of corporate profits are going to big banks, the financialization of our capitalist economy, in which more and more billions of dollars are made in order to make deals as opposed to producing products that people actually use. How could it be in the states that 1% of the population own 42% of the wealth, yet 22% of the children live in utter poverty? I'm talking about children of all colors. And when you go to the chocolate side of town, 40% of precious children living in poverty in the richest nation of the history of the world is morally obscene and spiritually profane. Where's the holy anger that Malcolm had? Where's the righteous indignation? How could it be that people go about their way in a normal, routinized way until it gets to their part of town? Same is true with education in the United States, the privatizing of public education, K through 12. Unbelievable. Moneymakers salivating, can't wait to get in on all of that money with for-profit education, where more and more rich brothers and sisters under 18 get taught, but poor brothers and sisters get tested. And the use of tests as a way of downplaying the role of cultivating attention, imagination, and intelligence. I'm sure some of you followed the teachers' strike in Chicago. We were there with Sister Karen Lewis. 684 schools in Chicago, 202 nurses for 684 schools. Only 175 libraries for 684 schools. And 1 out of 4 of those schools have no arts program whatsoever. So the very folk that Malcolm was talking about, especially the precious young folk, they're growing up in the hood. 50% unemployment for the youth. 25% unemployment for everybody else. Bullets flying. Drugs on the corner. Fathers drifting oftentimes, but not all the time. Mothers overworked and underplayed. Go to elementary school, mental detectors every day, like what will happen to me on Friday when I try to leave England and go back to America, going through the mental detectors at the airport. They have it every day. And then they get there, not enough nurses. They get there, classes of 42. Not like Finland, 14, 15. Not like Finland, culture of cooperation and trust, as opposed to in America, competition and choice. It's not like Finland, 98% of their teachers and principals unionized. No. And they didn't have no access to the arts. Paideia without the arts. Paideia without music. And then we wonder why we see the decline of hip-hop, one of the great cultural creations in the last 50 years, initiated by those very poor black youth. Can't play the instruments. Some of them don't even know what it's like to sing in tune. So. But you make a lot of money singing out of tune. Not a matter of quality. It's just spectacle. From Aretha Franklin to Beyonce. My God, what a drop. What a drop! I love Beyonce, Jay-Z too. I've had Jay-Z in my classes. That was fascinating. He comes to, oh, Brother West, you know, I've been playing Plato, the biggies, Socrates all my life. I said, you're a lyrical genius, brother, but you got to get your spirit together. You need to be part of a tradition connected to Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer. Have you heard of Curtis Mayfield? Have you heard of Gil Scott-Heron? Have you heard of Nina Simone? Have you heard of OJ's talking about Love Train? Have you heard of the Isley Brothers talking about fight the power? It's not just a matter of being some superficial entertainer in the culture of spectacle and surface. It's a matter of using your music as a way of generating paideia critical examination as well as learning how to love. Have you heard of John Coltrane? A Love Supreme. Do you see the Socratic dimensions in that song where spirituality is such profound doubting and questioning, but at the same time the spirituality is such genuine giving and compassion? It's not just a matter of your diagnosis and your prognosis, but it's also a matter of kenosis, a self-emptying. Malcolm X was a self-emptier. He gave everything of what he had when he was shot. And they put him in the coffin. They said he had the body of a man 55, 60 or so because he had used every ounce of his existence as a way of trying to speak the truth as he understood it, to bear witness as he understood it in the face of the repressive apparatus of the U.S. Empire, the FBI and the CIA, including some of the vicious critics within his own community, black community, and of course those who killed him were in fact members of the Nation of Islam, the very organization that he had helped expand. Yes, when you attempt to be a Socratic truth teller and a prophetic witness bearer, you're not just speaking truth to power, you're also trying to speak truth to the relatively powerless. And you will be wounded and scarred by the powers that be. You will be wounded and scarred by the relatively powerless, including folk in your own neighborhood. Why? Well, I wrote a song with a genius named Bootsy Collins. His latest album, Funk Capital of the World. He actually came up with the title, but I like to claim it. When love is a threat. What happens when you really fall in love with wisdom? When you really fall in love with justice? When you really fall in love with your neighbor? Do you not end up cutting so radically against the grain that you got to check yourself for the pathology of self-righteousness? Because you feel as if there's so few who are as awakened as you are. And sometimes that is the case. Very few were as awakened as Malcolm X in 1964. And I was glad to hear that 700 people showed up. We know in 1964 in America, the two lecturers who gathered the biggest crowds were Barry Goldwater 1, Malcolm X 2. And that's a hell of a juxtaposition. Barry Goldwater, of course, was an exemplary right-wing brother. Well, I call him a brother because he's human, and I'm a libertarian. I believe people have a right to be wrong. Yeah, people have a right to be wrong. I fight for their right to be wrong as long as they don't engage in injurious harm. But Malcolm, number 2, at the same time, they were hungry and thirsty for what he had to say, but also there could be a kind of exoticizing. Let's see what this Negro is like. You see, let's put him under the category of entertainment rather than education. And Malcolm resisted that over and over again. He said, I'm going to be myself. And I am a Muhammad-loving free black man concerned about serious fundamental social transformation. But I'm going to surprise some folk. I'm going to say some things that they don't expect, so that they leave Socratized, unsettled, unhoused, and unnerved. You all have been very kind to give me all this time. I started on a Socratic note. I want to end on a blue note, because you can't talk about Malcolm X unless you talk about the blues. He was a blues man to the core. To the core. And of course, we live in a world with the blues. I know Britain has deep blues. I think the Queen is going to give a speech fairly soon. Is that right? It's going to be shot through with the blues for poor people and working people and public education, a whole host of very, very crucial issues we ought to be attending to. But the blues has always taught the world, going back to Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and Muddy Waters, and B.B. King, that you have to be Socratic and prophetic, and being on intimate terms with catastrophe, but not allow yourself to succumb to hatred, revenge, xenophobia, envy. And that's very difficult. B.B. King says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. That's Sophocles' Antigone right there, isn't it? Every force in the world against you, and the one figure you thought you could depend on, you begin to get a little skeptical and agnostic about. But how does B.B. say it? Just like with Malcolm, I'm sure when he stood right upstairs, you see that beautiful smile. And it's not the smile of Obama. That smile hides and conceals a lot of criminality. It hides and conceals a refusal to talk about poverty. It hides and conceals the intimate relations with Wall Street and a refusal to bail out homeowners. No, Malcolm's smile came from the depths not just of his soul, but it came from a tradition of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. It's the smile of a people who've been wrestling with white supremacist catastrophe for 400 years, but can still produce a Marvin Gaye who, when he says what's going on, he's not talking about the hatred inside of his soul. He's talking about how can he awaken persons in such a way that empathy, love, compassion flows in the face of that catastrophe. Malcolm always reminded us of the catastrophes, always reminded us of the forms of criminality, but he refused at his best to fall in the trap of hatred. And when he did, when he said, for example, that white brothers and sisters were devils, and he said it sincerely, and he was wrong, he was immoral in saying it, but it was his cruel attempt to keep track of the devilish behavior of too many white brothers and sisters as they became well adjusted to white supremacy. And when he changed his mind, when he died and was reborn and said, I'm wrong to say white brothers and sisters were devils, but too many of them still in that devilish behavior. I'm keeping track of that. They said, Brother Malcolm, we appreciate your progress. And you keep track of our behavior. We're going to wrestle with the white supremacy inside of us. We're going to wrestle with the white supremacist structures in the economy and the nation state. Keep track of us, Malcolm. And Malcolm says, I need to grow too. If he were around, I would think he would be saying similar things about vicious forms of patriarchy. He'd be saying similar things about vicious forms of anti-Semitism, losing sight of our Jewish brothers and sisters, even as we ought to rightly have a hatred of any occupation, Israeli occupation or any other occupation. It's not a contradiction to be able to affirm the humanity of Jewish brothers and sisters and still have a profound affirmation of the humanity of Palestinian brothers and sisters as they wrestle with ugly forms of Israeli occupation. Malcolm said, walk that tightrope. He can walk that tightrope, but he wants to be honest. He wants to be decent. I can look for an Africa and say, oh, look at the magnificent wave of anti-colonial struggles, but oh my God, those autocratic leaders shot through with greed, shot through with resentment and envy, subjugating their African peoples themselves. Where's the accountability? Where's the answerability? Where's the responsibility of our African leaders, given the fact that in the 21st century, that continent more and more will be the focus of unbelievable fight for resources. I talked to my dear sister going back to Kenya as a doctor 5 years from now. I can't wait to go straight to Nairobi and just get a checkup from you. Absolutely. But we need governments in Africa who meet the standards of what the everyday people in Africa deserve. Same would be true in the Arab world. All the talk about supporting Palestinians, but oftentimes using them as a political football in order to hide and conceal your own hierarchy, hide and conceal your own maldistribution of wealth. Arab brothers and sisters, human like everybody else, accountable, answerable. Same is true in Latin America, same is true in Asia. I won't go on and on, but that's Malcolm. He starts local, ends up global, and has that smile. Let us never forget that the smile that Malcolm X has is his way of letting us know that no matter how Socratic we are, or prophetic we are, or blues-like we are in wrestling with the catastrophic, that in the end, we have to empower and inspire each other. The impending ecological catastrophe is real. It is unclear that we as a species even have the intellectual, moral, and spiritual, political resources to sustain life on the planet. Malcolm didn't talk about that in 1964, but he would want us to. Do we have what it takes? It's an open question. But the conclusion is like a practical Aristotelian syllogism. It's not a proposition. It's not a doctrine. It's not a dogma. It's a way of life. It's a mode of being in the world. It's us responding to the question, what kind of human being do we want to be? And thank God this brother, over the course of his life, in the answer to that question, enacted, embodied integrity, decency, honesty, virtue, not in a perfect way, but in a way that inspires us, in a way that empowers us. When you all see his picture there in Cafe Revolution, and I shall always recall that picture in Cafe Revolution. They've got a house named after Dartmouth College. El-Hajj Malik Shabazz will be inspired. And we'll hold hands across the pond and say we're going to do the best that we can with what we have. Thank you all so very much.